Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about biomedical issues in our continuing study of biblical ethics. Geisler points out the contrast between the Christian view versus the humanistic view. That is, the Christian view sees us as called to serve God, as opposed to the humanistic view where there are those that want to take the place of God. They want to play God. And the Christian view sees the legitimate use of voluntary treatment. In other words, you don't do something against someone's will. You treat them, as opposed to the humanistic view that sees, no, I'm going to put this upon somebody, maybe even before they're even born, a compulsory treatment. The Christian view looks at the advances of science as improving human life, and that can be a good thing. I'm in a room right now where there's air conditioning. I'm glad that there's air conditioning. It's rather warm outside, as opposed to the humanistic view that wants to focus more on creating life, those things that are within God's purview. The Christian view sees a good call to repair human life, to try to fix those things that are broken, as opposed to recreating human life and going back and starting something anew. The Christian view sees a good and worthy cause in the maintenance of life, maintaining life. We have things that have overcome diseases and cures and operations, and that's all good. I believe it is. The humanistic view instead wants to talk about the engineering of life, to make life, notice, mechanically and maybe biologically better by the use of scientific, genetic construction and things like that. The Christian view wants to look at genetic fitness. Of course, genes are important, and that's in contrast to the humanistic view that wants to embrace genetic fabrication. In the Christian view, there is the cooperation with nature, and I would say with the creator of nature, the cooperation with God, as opposed to control over nature and trying to bypass God. God is sovereign in the Christian view. God doesn't even exist. Man is sovereign in the humanistic view. Now, there are some other biomedical issues. For example, the issue of organ transplants. I think that can be a good thing, provided that the host is willing, he's desirous of that. He's perhaps he's left a living will saying, look, take these body parts and use them to somebody else's best. Maybe a kidney or an eye or whatever it is can be used. Genetic surgery is again looking to correct those defects. That can be, I think, a positive thing. To restore life can be good. Now, that's not the same thing as changing life. That's not to say that I ought to try to do something that will overcome just natural processes. One of the things that naturally takes place is that we get old. Should we try to reverse that? That's an interesting question. Nowadays it's becoming very popular for people who don't like the gender with which they've been born to go and get an operation and to change that. That's something, God made people a certain way. Now, it might be different if there was, some sort of genetic anomaly where a person sort of came out, sort of mixed, and you're trying to fix something that naturally ought to be one way or the other. But that's not the same thing as a transgender operation. And so that, I would say that's very unbiblical. Gender detection and selection. Well, gender detection, nowadays you can do that sort of thing. When my wife and I had our daughter, they didn't have such abilities back then. You had to wait until the child was born to see if they were male or female. Nowadays you can do that through ultrasound, and you can be acquainted with is it going to be a boy or a girl, and that's not a bad thing because you're not trying to change something, but it's already at the point, and not too far in the future, where you could see someone maybe trying to deliberately say, no, I don't want a boy, I want a girl, and so therefore I'm going to change that and select the gender of my child. Well, that's something that's more in God's keeping. Artificial insemination. Here's a question. Is it appropriate to artificially do that which normally you do biologically? And of course, this is done sometimes because the biological parts aren't working. There's been a lack of a function, and so we're trying to correct something that's not working too well. Um, and of course, that can be by a husband, or it can be by maybe an anonymous donor, somebody else, and you say, well, what are the ethics of that? And Geisler discusses that in his book. So I'll refer you to his conversation. Other biomedical issues, the issue of surrogate motherhood, of again implanting, by artificial means. Otherwise, you're talking about maybe adultery, and but a mother, and remember, there's a biblical sort of precedent. That's not saying that it's good, because sometimes the things that people did in the Bible were not good. But there were those instances. For example, Sarah couldn't have children, so she had Abraham take Hagar to have children by her. That was sort of Hagar was serving as a surrogate mother. That did not have a good ending, and that was not something that had been endorsed and where God said, go do that. Just because Abraham, or just because some of the patriarchs did certain things, sometimes they did wrong things. Sometimes they made bad decisions. In vitro fertilization, likewise, we can sometimes have eggs harvested, and actually know a couple that took this route because they were not able to have children. And now they have some children. I don't know all the details of how everything worked out, but that was able to be provided. Is that proper? And of course, one of the questions that they wrestled with, well, if we have, typically they don't just take one egg and try to fertilize it. They have a whole basket full. Well, now we have all of these embryos that have become, they're alive. Do we now have a responsibility to raise all of them? Suddenly they could go from 0 children to 7 or 8 children. And what are their responsibilities in such a case? It's a worthy question to ask before you get into that situation. Organ and tissue harvesting. And when we talk about harvesting, we're talking about maybe a child or even an embryo that has died. Well, are we killing it in order to harvest it, or is this something where, and of course I'm not because we're talking about an infant that has not yet even been born. I'm certainly not gaining consent. So is that an issue when we talked earlier about the importance of gaining consent for doing these sorts of things? Stem cell cures, and that has been a big issue. Of course, things have changed now. In fact, science is continually changing. As what before you had to have an embryo, and I've been given to understand that that's now been superseded. But I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to comment upon those things. But it's still worthy of continuing study. These are continuing issues. And each new discovery asks the question, here's what we can do, now what should we do? Cryonics. Is it possible, and this is done sometimes when a person who is donating certain organs, they have now died, and it is frozen. Those body parts are frozen so that they can be taken and taken to somebody that's in need of maybe a kidney or an eye or something and transplanted. That can be a good thing, but am I freezing somebody in hopes of restoring them to life? Well, that's another question, and again, the question comes up, is it ethical to do that sort of thing? Am I trying to avoid that curse of death that has been brought upon the world? But remember, there's also a promise of a resurrection, and what's happening with that? gene splicing, trying to change what God has made us. And if it's, again, if it's to correct something that's gone wrong, I think I can see that, and I think that you can have maybe biblical warrant for physicians and doing that which cures something. But am I just trying to change someone and something the way that God made them? It's an ethical question. These are ethical issues. And now we come to the question of cloning. Um, and this isn't just science fiction. Uh, yes, I know. Yes, I know that there have been a number of sci-fi movies. Most of them are sort of goofy and sometimes even funny as they explore this question of cloning. But back in the 1990s, Dolly the sheep was cloned. Now, she only lived to be 5 years, but since that time, and she did die, but it wasn't because of the cloning issue. She just developed something that was common among sheep and died earlier. Other clones have been much more successful in having a full lifespan, and so that's something that now scientists are able to do. Clones have been used already to reproduce extinct species, and I'm not talking about bringing back dinosaurs, but I'm talking about species that have become extinct largely because of mankind's use and abuse of the environment. And I'm not talking about strange animals, but different types of perhaps deer or some sort of normal animal that has now been reintroduced through cloning. Now, there have been some benefits of this. For example, food resources. And it might surprise you to find out that certain foods are the results of cloning. Not that you can grow the food faster, but we have certain foods that are genetically worked so that there won't be more people that starve to death in, for example, parts of India, where there's genetically mutated grain that grows bigger sections of grain so that people won't starve to death in what could be taken as overpopulated areas. So food resources is an issue. Childbirth for non-fertile couples, is that appropriate? Now we talked about in vitro fertilization, but this is something different. Is it appropriate to take such a person and clone them and make an identical duplicate? Now it's not going to be totally identical, but pretty close to it, of one of those couples. The growth of body parts, and I know this looks sort of strange and odd, and I'm sorry, but this is really taking place. The growth of body parts to replace a damaged organ. Notice somebody had lost an ear, and so on their hand, they're actually growing an ear so that they can be surgically taken and placed where an ear belongs. It's not they're not going to be able to hear out of their arm because there's no nerve endings there for that. But to correct something that has been damaged. And yet, ethical issues also arise. For example, the endangering, and this is in the area of cloning, the endangering of individuality. I am me, and there shouldn't be an attempt to try to get another me. Would a clone, the question is asked, have equal rights? And well, it's after all, this is just a person. They're born a different way, but they still have to grow and develop, and in the same way a real person does. Does one have the right to be a unique individual? And the person who's cloned isn't being asked that. Um, the a clone that's involved in the harvesting of organs. Now it's different if it's my own arm and my own ear that's being grown. Well, that's just me. I'm having control over that. But how about to raise up a clone so that I might just use those as body parts for someone else? The use of stem cells was such an issue, and that's still an ongoing issue and still in a state of flux because scientists are finding better ways and ways around those ethical issues where no, we're not going to create a life, but we're going to find some other way to grow those stem cells. The fighting of genetic diseases can be done with genetic manipulation, and that maybe can be a good thing. But what about designer people? In other words, I decide to have a child, and gee, I think I'll have a girl instead of a boy. Gee, I think I'd like this child to have blue eyes instead of brown eyes. Gee, I think I'd like to have this child have this trait. So whether it's choosing a gender or gee, I'd like to have my child a little bit smarter so I can actually grow them for to have a higher level of intelligence, or maybe a lower level of intelligence, because I've decided that really smart people aren't that happy. So I want my child to be happier. So I'm going to bring their intelligence level down a bit. So choosing gender or growing intelligence, or planning your child's future. I'd like my child to be a basketball player, so I'm going to make them, extra tall. Or I'd like them to be a musician because I couldn't play an instrument, so I'm going to sort of choose what I want them to do. And notice that's taking away that child's free will. A part of this, because think about this, the people that can afford such designer people genetic enhancing would be those who would be wealthy, and that means I could have two classes of people. I could have the wealthy elite that are genetically enhanced, and I could have the poor common folk that are unable to compete and that will be relegated to a lower class of society by their very genetic makeup. A very unequal sort of life for humanity. And so these are certainly genetic issues. By contrast, Psalms chapter 139. This is in that wonderful passage that talks about the various attributes of God. And the psalmist, speaking to God, says, "For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you." And he's speaking to God, "For I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." He goes on to say in verse 15, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret." Who made me? Notice it's God that did the making, "and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them." So that we are made from the hands of God, as pictured in the psalm. And we should not be seeking to be remade in the hands of some scientist.